The alarm went off at 5:14 a.m., same as always, and Elena Vasquez didn't so much wake up as she simply stopped pretending to sleep. She'd been lying in the dark for the better part of an hour, staring at the water stain on the ceiling above her bed, the one she'd promised herself she'd paint over back in March, which had then become April, which had become June, which had somehow, without her permission, become the beginning of November. The stain had spread a little since March, she'd noticed. She'd added it to the list in her head, the list that never got shorter, the list that followed her into sleep on the nights when sleep actually came. She sat up slowly, the way a person does when their body has started keeping score. Her lower back ached from the double shift she'd pulled on Monday at Meridian Medical Supply, where she worked as a billing coordinator and occasional everything else. A job that paid enough to keep the lights on and the refrigerator stocked with something slightly better than nothing. Her right shoulder had been tight for weeks. She'd probably slept on it wrong again, probably on the couch again, probably after falling asleep helping Marco with his reading comprehension homework, while simultaneously trying to stay awake long enough to put a load of laundry in the dryer so the boys would have clean uniforms in the morning. Probably. She stood in the dark of her bedroom for a moment, her feet on the cold hardwood floor, and she breathed. Just breathed. It was the only thing she did entirely for herself in those early morning hours, those 3 or 4 slow breaths before the day crashed in through the walls and took her under again. She'd read somewhere, in one of those magazine articles she only ever got to read in waiting rooms, that breathing intentionally could reset the nervous system. She wasn't sure it worked, but she did it anyway, because some mornings it was the only prayer she knew how to say. The boys' rooms were quiet. That was the miracle of 5:14 a.m. The house still belonged to silence, and she moved through it carefully, the way you move through something beautiful that you know won't last. She passed the door of the room where Marco, Mateo, and Miguel slept in their 3 matching beds, her triplets, her thunderstorm, her reason for every single thing, and she paused for just a moment, her hand flat against the painted wood of the door. She could hear the specific rhythm of their breathing, each boy with his own signature sound. Marco breathed through his mouth when he was deeply under, a soft, unconscious snoring that she had long ago decided was the most comforting sound on earth. Mateo always slept curled on his side, and if you listened closely, you could hear him sighing, small, periodic sighs, as though he was working through something in his sleep. Miguel, the youngest of the 3 by 4 minutes, slept in near total silence, and it had taken Elena 2 full years of panicked nighttime checks before she'd trusted that silence the way she now did. 7 years old. They were 7 years old, and she could still feel the exact weight of each of them in her arms from the night they were born. Marco first, screaming, certain the world owed him a welcome. Mateo second, quieter, blinking at the lights with those enormous dark eyes. And Miguel last, so still that the room had gone terribly hushed before he finally, mercifully cried. She had been 26 years old and utterly alone in the most profound way a person can be alone. Her husband, Daniel, had left 8 months into the pregnancy, not dramatically, not with cruelty exactly, but with a kind of slow receding, like a tide going out, until one morning she woke up and he was simply gone, and in his place was a note that said he wasn't ready and he was sorry and he hoped she'd understand someday. She hadn't understood. She still didn't, but she had stopped needing to. She made coffee in the dark kitchen, moving by habit and muscle memory, and she stood at the window while it brewed and looked at the street below. The neighborhood was starting to wake. She could see the blue flicker of a television through the curtains across the street, the orange glow of someone's porch light, a car idling at the corner, the world assembling itself for another day. She poured her coffee and added too much milk because the coffee was too hot, and she didn't have time to wait for it to cool, and she drank it standing up, leaning against the counter, already running the mental arithmetic of the morning, backpacks checked, lunches packed, uniforms located, Breakfast made, hair brushed, teeth brushed, shoes on the right feet. Miguel still sometimes got those backwards, and it melted her heart in a way she didn't entirely understand. And then the drive to school, and then straight to work, where she would spend 8 to 10 hours staring at insurance codes and billing software, and the kind of fluorescent lighting that slowly, quietly dissolves a person's sense of self. On the refrigerator, held up by a magnet shaped like a sunflower that Marco had won at a school fair, was a paper calendar. It was the kind of old-fashioned paper calendar that she kept specifically because the boys liked to mark things on it. Holidays, field trips, the day. To understand the weight of that moment, you would have to understand what the boys had seen. Children see more than adults believe they do. This is one of the most persistent and consequential misunderstandings between generations. The adult assumption that children, being small and preoccupied with their own immediate universe, are largely unaware of the larger emotional landscape they inhabit. In fact, children are almost constitutionally attuned to the emotional weather of the adults who raise them. They may not have the vocabulary for what they observe, they may not be able to name what they see, but they feel it with a precision that most adults have learned, through years of productive numbing, to avoid. Marco, Mateo, and Miguel Vasquez had spent 7 years watching their mother. They had watched her fall asleep on the couch with her laptop still open, a spreadsheet glowing on the screen, her reading glasses still on her face. They had watched her eat standing up at the kitchen counter because sitting down for a meal felt like a luxury she hadn't earned. They had watched her take phone calls from the billing office in the car, in the parking lot of their school, in the bathroom with the door locked, her voice always professionally even, always competent, always performing the version of herself the world required. They had seen her cry exactly twice. Once when she thought she was alone in the backyard and Marco had looked out his bedroom window, and once when she was on the phone with someone late at night and Mateo had padded out of his room for water and heard her voice through the closed kitchen door, doing something it never did in front of them. They had watched her put their Halloween costumes together at midnight the night before Halloween because she hadn't had time before that. They had watched her iron their shirts on Sunday evenings with the kind of focused care that looked like meditation. They had watched her negotiate with 3 different doctor's offices, 2 insurance companies, and a school administrator all in the same afternoon while simultaneously making dinner and helping Marco with his spelling words. They had watched her laugh, really laugh, approximately once every 2 weeks, usually at something absurd one of them did, and they had noticed, the way children notice things they cannot name, how much younger she looked in those moments, how the tiredness left her face and something else came through, something bright and unguarded that they would have given almost anything to keep there. They had also watched the calendar. Mateo had been the one to notice, 3 days ago, the small notation their grandmother had made on a Christmas card last year. November 12, Mama's birthday, tucked into the drawer of the telephone table where their mother kept important papers. He'd been looking for a permission slip he'd misplaced and found the card instead, and he'd stood holding it for a long moment doing the arithmetic with the calendar on the refrigerator. He'd brought it to Marco, who was the family's designated authority on plans and logistics, and Marco had looked at it and said, with the gravity of someone twice his age, "We have to do something." Miguel had said, "But what can we do? We don't have money." "We have stuff," Marco had said, "and we have Uncle Remy." Remy. Remy was the person they went to when they needed the kind of adult help that felt too big for them, but too important to let go. He'd been a fixture of their lives from their very beginning. In their earliest memories, he was simply there, a steady, solid presence that smelled like the same soap he'd apparently used his entire adult life. He came every Wednesday, he came to their soccer games, he came on the bad nights, the nights when Mama looked like she might be approaching some edge none of them had a name for, and he would sit at the kitchen table and drink coffee with her and talk in the low voices that meant the conversation was not for young ears, and afterward their mother always seemed like she'd been slightly repressurized, like a tire that had been filled back up to the right level. When the boys called him, Mateo had his number memorized. Remy had gone quiet on the phone for long enough that Mateo said, "Uncle Remy, are you still there?" And Remy had said, Yeah, buddy, I'm here. I was just thinking." What he was thinking was that he could not believe he had also forgotten, that he had been so close to Elena's life for 7 years, had watched her carry it all, had helped where he could, and felt the guilt of not helping more, and he had forgotten her birthday. It sat in him like a stone. He swallowed it down and said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do." Coach Davis had come into the picture because Marco, who had inherited his mother's practical determination and also her occasional failure to think through the full consequences of a plan, had called Coach Davis from Elena's phone, a phone he knew the passcode to because his mother had given it to all three of them for emergencies, and he'd simply said, "Coach Davis, it's Marco Vasquez. It's my mom's birthday tomorrow, and we're doing a surprise. Uncle Remy says you can come." There had been a silence on Coach Davis's end, and then he had said in the measured tone of a man who understood that 7-year-olds require. The sound that came out of Elena Vasquez when she finally understood what she was looking at was not a word. It was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but some honest, unguarded sound from a place below language, the place where the body stores everything the mind has been too busy to process. It was the sound of a wall coming down. She stood in the doorway in her coat, and she looked at her three boys in their crooked bow ties, and she felt something move through her that she had no name for, something large and unmanageable, and not entirely unlike the first breath you take when you've been underwater for too long. Miguel was still looking at her, his chin still trembling, his small hands holding his corner of the banner. She crossed the room in 3 steps, and she went down onto her knees on the living room floor in front of her youngest son, not because she made the decision to kneel, but because her body understood that the only appropriate response to this moment was to make herself small enough to be present in it. She put her hands on his face, the face that had her jaw and her nose and Daniel's eyes, the face she had memorized in the first seconds after he was born, and had been memorizing, in all its daily changes, ever since. And she looked at him and she said, "Baby," and that was all she could manage before Miguel wrapped both his arms around her neck and pressed his face into her shoulder and held on. "We didn't forget, Mama," he said into her neck. "We didn't forget." This was the thing that broke her completely. Because she had forgotten her own birthday, because she had been so deep in the daily machinery of keeping their lives running that she had lost track of her own existence as something worth marking, and her 7-year-old son, her quiet, careful, serious boy, had not forgotten. Her children, who she spent every waking hour caring for, had turned around and cared for her, and the love of that reversal was almost more than she could hold. She felt the other two arrive then, Mateo from the left, wrapping himself around her arm with his characteristic whole-body commitment, Marco from the right, pressed against her side with his chin up in the air the way he always did when he was trying to be brave and feeling a lot. She was kneeling on the floor with all 3 of them pressed against her, the banner crumpled between them, and she was crying, really crying, not the quiet, careful crying she did in the car or in the shower, but the kind of crying that involves her whole body, that sounds like something being released, that is made of years as much as it is made of this moment. "I love you," she said. It was inadequate. It was the most inadequate thing she had ever said. She said it again. "I love you so much. All of you. I love you so much." "We love you more," Marco said in his most definitive voice, the one that indicated this was not a negotiation. "We practiced a song," Mateo said. "We have to do the song." He pulled back slightly because Mateo had strong feelings about the scheduling of planned events. "Uncle Remy, should we do the song?" She had almost forgotten, in the overwhelming immediacy of the boys, that Remy and Thomas were in the room. She looked up now, from the floor, from the midst of her boys, and she saw them. Remy, her brother-in-law, the man who had told her 7 years ago that he wasn't leaving and had kept that promise in 10,000 small ways she had spent a decade being grateful for and not saying enough. He was standing with his arms crossed and his jaw doing that thing it did, and his eyes were bright in the candlelight, and he gave her a small nod, not a reassuring nod, not a "you're okay" nod, but the kind of nod that says, "I see you, and you deserve this, and I'm not going to make it weird by talking about it." Thomas Davis was a few feet away from Remy, his hands in his jacket pockets, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, or perhaps she had seen pieces of it on Saturday mornings, in the moments between drills when he'd catch her eye on the sideline, and something. There is a particular kind of man, not a common kind, but not a rare kind either, if you know where to look, who expresses devotion through presence rather than performance. Not through grand statements or theatrical demonstrations, but through the patient accumulation of small, consistent, reliable acts, the showing up, the staying, the paying attention. These men often go unrecognized because their love doesn't announce itself. It simply exists, year after year in the background of someone else's life, holding up walls they never get credit for holding. Remy Vasquez was 31 years old, and he had spent 7 of those years being the man that his brother had failed to be. He had not done it out of guilt, though in the early days there had been some of that, the specific, searing guilt of sharing DNA with someone who had walked out on 3 infants and the woman carrying them. He had done it because Elena was good, and the boys were everything, and some things were simply right. And Remy had always been a person who understood rightness in his body before he could explain it in words. He had changed diapers, he had done school runs, he had sat in waiting rooms during pediatric appointments and learned the names of ear infection bacteria and the proper dosage of children's ibuprofen by weight. He had coached baseball in the backyard even though he was not particularly athletic and had once taken a softball directly to the temple and told the boys it was fine and gone home and iced it for 2 hours. He had fixed the bathroom faucet and the back gate and the drawer in the kitchen that had been sticking for 2 years, and he had done all of this without ever suggesting that these acts created a debt, without ever implying that his presence came with conditions. He had watched Elena be tired. He had watched her be lonely in the specific way that people who are surrounded by others are lonely. The loneliness not of isolation, but of invisibility, of giving so much of yourself outward that the self begins to feel like it no longer has an inside. He had watched her eat the meals she made in 3 or 4 standing bites between checking whether the boys had eaten their vegetables. He had watched her choose again and again to put herself last, and he had understood this as both her greatest strength and the thing that most worried him about her, because a person cannot pour from empty forever, and he had been watching her approach empty for a long time. Tonight he had done the thing he should have done 100 times before. He had simply made a moment that was about her. Not about her as a mother, not about her as the person who held everything together, but about her as a human being who had been born on a specific day 33 years ago and who deserved to have that day acknowledged. It had taken 3 7-year-olds to think of it, and he was going to have to sit with that, but he had shown up when called, which was all he knew how to do, and it would have to be enough. Thomas Davis stood a little apart from the reunion between Elena and Remy, giving them the space that the moment required, and he watched and felt, without embarrassment, the particular fullness of being present for something true. He was not a man who sought emotional experiences. He was a man who drove a practical car and coached youth sports and graded the essays of his high school students with careful attention, and went home to an apartment that he kept clean because tidiness was a form of self-respect that had been drilled into him by a father who believed in it. He was not a man who often found himself standing in someone's candlelit living room at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday night, watching a woman discover that she was more loved than she knew. He had thought about Elena Vasquez more than he'd admitted to himself, not with any particular agenda. He was not a man who moved quickly toward things. He moved toward them the way water moves around obstacles, slowly and eventually. But he had thought about her. He had noticed her in the ways that matter.
Her intelligence, her humor on the rare occasions when it surfaced on the sideline, the quality of her attention, the specific and irreducible way she loved her boys, which was one of the most moving things he'd ever witnessed, and he'd witnessed it at 8 a.m. on cold Saturday mornings when most people's.
Later, she would try to explain it to herself. The specific quality of that night, the way it settled into her differently from other nights, why it felt like something had genuinely shifted in the bedrock of how she understood her own life. She thought it had something to do with being allowed to receive. This was the thing she had not known she had forgotten how to do. Somewhere in the 7 years of giving, of pouring herself into every crack and corner of her boys' lives, of filling every gap that Daniel's absence had left, of working and budgeting and cooking and cleaning and loving with every cell of her available self, she had stopped being able to let anything come back in. She had developed, without meaning to, a kind of sealed quality, a one-directionality that she had told herself was strength, but which was, she understood now in the soft aftermath of cake and candlelight, also a kind of self-erasure. You cannot receive love if you have arranged yourself to be only its source. The boys had fallen asleep, finally, at 10 o'clock, significantly past their bedtime, but this was understood by all parties to be a special occasion, and she had sat on the edge of each of their beds, one by one, the way she always did, but which felt different tonight, weighted with something more. Marco was already deeply under, his mouth slightly open, one arm thrown over his head in the posture of someone who has expended everything. She had sat with him for a moment and looked at his face, the strong jaw that was going to be even stronger in 20 years, the dark lashes, the particular peace of a boy who had planned something for his mother and made it happen, and was now satisfied with the work of the day. She had touched his hair, very gently so as not to wake him. Mateo was in his side-sleeping position, and he said, without fully opening his eyes, "Did you like it, Mama?" And she had said, "It was the best night of my life." And he had smiled with his eyes still closed and said, "Good. I picked the good markers." And she had bitten the inside of her cheek against fresh tears, because Mateo, in his 7-year-old certainty that the right-colored markers were a significant contribution to a human being's happiness, was not wrong. Miguel was awake when she got to his room. He was lying on his back in the dark, looking at the ceiling with the thoughtful expression that was his resting expression, the one that meant he was processing something with more depth than his years should have granted him. She had sat beside him, and he had turned his head to look at her, and he said, "Mom, do you know you work really hard?" "I know," she said. "We know, too," he said. "We always know." He looked at the ceiling again. "We just don't always know how to say it." She had taken his hand under the covers and held it. "You said it tonight," she said, "in the best possible way." He thought about this. "Do you feel better?" She thought about the honest answer and decided to give it. "Yes," she said, "I feel a lot better." "Good," he said, "because you're our mom and you're supposed to feel good." He said this with the same authority Marco brought to negotiations and the same certainty Mateo brought to the deployment of colored markers. The unshakable conviction of a child who believes that justice, correctly applied, results in the people who deserve good things having them. She had sat with him for a moment and looked at his face, the strong jaw that was going to be even stronger in 20 years, the dark lashes, the particular peace of a boy who had planned something for his mother and made it happen, and was now satisfied with the work of the day. She had touched his hair, very gently so as not to wake him. Mateo was in his side-sleeping position, and he said, without fully opening his eyes, "Did you like it, Mama?" And she had said, "It was the best night of my life." And he had smiled with his eyes still closed and said, "Good. I picked the good markers."
and she had bitten the inside of her cheek against fresh tears, because Mateo, in his 7-year-old certainty that the right colored markers were a significant contribution to a human being's happiness, was not wrong. Miguel was awake when she got to his room. He was lying on his back in the dark, looking at the ceiling with the thoughtful expression that was his resting expression, the one that meant he was processing something with more depth than his years should have granted him. She had sat beside him, and he had turned his head to look at her, and he said, "Mom, do you know you work really hard?" "I know," she said. "We know too," he said. "We always know." He looked at the ceiling again. "We just don't always know how to say it." She had taken his hand under the covers and held it. "You said it tonight," she said, "in the best possible way." He thought about this.